So I will talk today about the relationship between natural and artificial intelligence, and I just share my thoughts and readings on this topic with you. And before I start, for me it's really important to tell you a little bit more about what my work is about normally. And so I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, which means that I'm interested in understanding the cognition and the neurocorrelates of cognition and the development of it. And so typically we do experiments that are behavioral experiments, recording accuracy and reaction times, but also using imagery techniques like EEG and fMRI to understand the brain activation pattern. And that means also that I'm not a computational neuroscientist, so I'm not doing these models at all myself, neither from a neuroscientific perspective, nor even less from an engineering perspective. So this is really my thoughts and readings. Yeah, I wanted to reflect a little bit on the relation between the what we call natural intelligence in the brain and the artificial intelligence generally, machine learning, and the question whether the brain is a good model for machine intelligence to start with. And I'll start also at the very beginning of these efforts to do artificial intelligence, where the answer to that question was a definite yes. For example, according to the inventor of the perceptron, which is a type of linear classifier that is really one of the ancestors of the learning machine, as you see it here. So this was actually a psychologist, Frank Rosenblatt. He's a US psychologist, and he was really inspired by the functioning of the neurons for designing his artificial intelligence. So let's start very briefly with the neurons. So here you have a classical depiction of the neuron with multiple branches as entries here on the top. The dendrites, apical and basal dendrites here, which are connecting the neurons with the preceding neurons via the synapses that we don't see here, but these would be small parts of the dendrites. And then the information is being integrated in the cell body, and it's being transmitted to the unique branch as an output, which is the axon here, towards the next neurons. And so the critical feature here is that the neuron, every neuron is receiving electrical inputs, and it's processing and transmitting a unique signal. So this unique signal is also called action potential, and we talk about it as trains of action potentials. And the intensity of the signal is really the frequency of these spiking activities. And this was also quite new in the 20th century, because actually it was really in the beginning of the 20th century that the neurons as a structure, as a biological structure, were discovered and described by these two researchers, Camilo Golgi and Santiago Ramón y Cajal, who received the Nobel Prize together for their work in 1906. And so Golgi, he presented here a staining method which he really allowed for the first time to visualize the neurons. And Cajal, he really was himself a very good artist in drawing these elements, but also he really had these insights into the structure of the brain and in the histology. So here, for example, we have a section through the visual cortex and to the motor cortex. And at that time, there were really a major breakthrough in terms of neurophysiology, because there were two major principles discovered of the nervous system. First, the principle of functional localization, so that we have specific tasks done in specific areas of the brain. Not every part of the brain does everything. And we have the neuron doctrine that says that really the tissue is made up of individual elements that are really physically separated from each other, which are the neurons. And so this is the basis on which then the work of McCulloch and Walter Pitts came in, which we've heard about also already on Sunday. So these two, they tried really to understand more generally how the brain could produce highly complex patterns by using these basic cells that are connected in sophisticated manners together. And in their paper here, Logical Calculus, which was also mentioned on Sunday by Sundberg, they have this proposal of an artificial neuron as really very like almost a caricature of a neuron, and they really inspire on the fact that this all or none nature of the firing of the neurons will then yield a network that can be modeled as logical propositions. So here is schematically this kind of McCulloch pit that these two invented and proposed. So it's very simplified in the sense that you have this neuron that is receiving inputs from other neurons and it's computing a weighted sum. If the weighted sum is below a certain threshold, the neuron doesn't fire, but if it's above, and it will fire. So the output of this artificial neuron is binary. And so, as just said, each binary neuron, it computes this weighted sum, and then of the inputs, and then it will perform the logical computations, and that's why also we can consider then the brain as a machine for logical inferences. Sorry, I'm going too fast. Yeah. So, and these were the, let's say, the different elements on which then Rosenblatt, he integrated into his perceptron, which was then the first really classifier. So he integrated this notion of binary neuron, computing the weighted sums, and the use of learning procedure, which was another critical element, that it is really allowing to adjust the activity of the neuron by correcting the error and modifying the weight of the sums. So these learning mechanisms, they were also inspired by, let's say, psychological and neuropsychological phenomenon. One very major contribution came from Donald Hebb, and the other one indirectly later validated by Eric Kandel. So Donald Hebb is actually the psychologist who is most cited of the 20th century, and he wrote this very influential book, The Organization of Behavior and Neuropsychological Theory, and where he really presents his idea on the brain organization and how this is based on the organization of neural circuits. That was a little bit different than before. It was always depicted as logical diagrams. So here it's really the focus on the neural circuits that Hebb is trying to think about. And he has one major, very, very influential idea. It's the one that you have the forms and function of the cell emblems, and that it's the way how the neurons connect together that constitute how they can store information and how they can produce engrams. So, like, let's quote Hebb here. For example, he says the general idea is an old one, so already at the time it was old, that any two cells or cells or systems of cells that are repeatedly active at the same time will tend to become associated, so that activity in one facilitates activity in the other. Or it goes on, and then he says a little bit more in detail, when one cell repeatedly assists in firing another, the axon of the first cell develops synaptic knobs, or enlarges them if they already exist, in contact with the soma of the second cell. And so the idea is really that the structure of learning, that learning occurs in the interconnected neurons here at the junction of the synapses, where the neurons connect. And he proposed the famous Hebb rule, saying that any learning is a change in the efficacy of the connections between neurons. So if two neurons repeatedly active together, the efficiency of their connection will increase. And this was actually validated by Eric Kandel and many others afterwards, who started to work on the neurophysiological basis of these learning mechanisms to really see how they were implemented in the brain. And he got the Nobel Prize for it in 2000. And you certainly heard about this work on the marine snail, on the aplysia, where he really described the neurophysiological basis of these mechanisms, but I won't go into detail. But so this is all coming into the perceptron, so which at the very simplest form of the perceptron is really just one artificial neuron, where you have here the inputs with the different weights to the neuron itself. And for example, here if we imagine that we are presenting this perceptron with an image, very simple 5 matrix of a C, so present the letter C. And then, of course, we would like it to recognize it, so say yes or 1 when it sees this shape of C here. And so the trick is that the perceptron, it will adjust its weights by really progressively making the output correspond to the expected output. And this is based on a large number of examples during the training phase. And then once it has been trained, we can deploy it, and then the perceptron should be able to recognize and say yes to every C and no to every D, for example. So this is what's being called supervised learning, because we have this input image, in this case it's an image, a table of numbers, with the desired output, the recognition, but also the actual output produced by the machine, which in this case, the YP produced. And it is about searching this function that is producing the expected Y based on X for any collection, and based on a number of examples that were used during the training. And that they can even do that for an X that was not shown in the training. And just a little bit more. So it's really about finding a function such that an input signal, for example, an image, but it could also be text, will produce an expected output. It can be the identification of an image. It could be another text as an answer, and by adjusting the weights here through training. So this is what's called general supervised learning or training, and when the perceptron or the machine is adjusting its weights, so that there is some generalization of learning that will occur going beyond the trained examples. In short, again, so you show an example X, for example, a C. If the answer is correct, spontaneously you don't change anything. If it's false, then you adjust in very small steps, saying, going backwards if it's wrong until it gets the right answer. And so here it's really this modification in small steps that are important until we have a stable situation. And we can say that this kind of learning procedure actually consists in minimization of a cost function, where the parameters of the cost functions, they are these adjustable weights of the system. But this works, but only to a certain degree, and obviously it was pretty limited. For example, it was very unsuccessful when there were a lot of variation in the size of the images or in the exact positions. So then the perceptron would never find could never be trained correctly. So for that, the next step then was to add a feature to the perceptron, or in this kind, it's actually an intermediate layer. So it was actually what's called a feature extractor that's being added between the input image and the neuron that we colored and Pitt's neuron that we just saw. So the idea here with the feature extractor is that it really it can detect the presence or absence of specific pattern, or even more complex shapes or objects in the input image. It will construct a vector that is describing the presence of these patterns and the intensity, and then this is the input that is given to the perceptron here. So actually the detected features, the presence or the absence. And this will allow then, for example, to be also successful when, for example, here the D is in quite different places. So the perceptron will nevertheless be able to do it, because so in some, by modifying this, so we modify the perceptron architecture so to allow for more complex operations by adding this additional layer. And what is important here at this stage of the development, this feature extractor, it was really constructed by hand by the programmer. So it was not something that was learned by the machine yet. So it is actually very complicated and time consuming. So this was also why at that moment the developments, they were not so spectacular. And so just to go back again, brief, let's say, mini history. So we have here in 1906 this work on the structure of the neural system. the nervous tissue by Golgi and Ramon Caral, and then in the 1950 here, Donald Hebb's work, and then in 57 there was the perceptron proposed, as I just said, and in between there were already, of course, other activities, and one important let's say, contribution was what's called the Dartmouth conference, because there actually some experts met and they made this declaration of the principles of artificial intelligence. So apparently it's where the term was first proposed of artificial intelligence. But I'm not an historian, I just read this, so don't kill me if it's wrong. And here then afterwards there was continuous work, for example textbooks, but also in the 70s there was this kind of AI winter, as it was quoted on Sunday also, because indeed after a lot of funding and enthusiasm, the funding was quite cut down, so it was of course then not so easy to continue the work. But nevertheless, in the 80s there was another major let's say, scientific advance in the field of neurophysiology that again was also very valuable to the development of artificial intelligence, and that's the work by Hubel and Wiesel, who also got the Nobel Prize for their work on the visual system of the cats. And so they got the Nobel Prize in 81, but they started working on this already in the 60s. This, it was, we will see this, what they were understanding in terms of how the visual system is functioning was very much used as an inspiration by different people working in artificial intelligence. And again, it could be computer scientists, for example, Fukushima, who kind of proposed the next much more sophisticated model that's called neocognitron, based on the perceptron. At first the cognitron, then the neocognitron, or Hinton, who's a major father of AI. And also psychologists like McLelland and Rommelhardt, or Hopfield and Sazhnovsky, that are biophysicists. And they have, in the 80s, they worked on what was called then parallel distributed processing or connectionist models, and so they already proposed that models with hidden layers and that were learning by retropropagation of the error. But overall, nevertheless, we have to say that from 95 to 2015, the interest was again much lower on the developments of the artificial neural networks, and it was more other approaches in machine learning, like the support vector machines, that most people worked on. And there were tremendous developments in this support vector machine type of machine learning, but less so in these neural networks. Nevertheless, there was also some work during that time, a little bit more in the background, and there were two major advances that were very important. One is what we just already saw also before. It's to continue really this idea of adding layers to the networks and having what we call these hidden layers. And the other one, and that's very, very important qualitative advance, is that we could actually also then train these hidden layers. So we don't need to pre-program them and figure out exactly how they should be, these feature detector layers, for example. So so this training of these multi-layer networks by gradient retropropagation, it's actually what's called deep learning today. And so these were really two major features that were progressively developed in this time between 95 and 2015. So one of these outcomes, one of these type of artificial neural networks is the convolution neural network. As you see it here, we'll go into this, because it's very important both because of its tremendous efficacy in terms of artificial intelligence, but also because, I mean, as a cognitive neuroscientist, it's very interesting because, again, it is based on many similarities and inspirations from what we know of how the brain is perceiving the world. And so on the function of the visual system. So the convolution neural networks, they are combining, as I just said, the training of systems by the gradient retropropagation. So again, like before, during the learning, the objective, they try to minimize an objective function, and they are characterized by a specific network of architecture of the network, which are simple and complex cells, inspired and as they really exist in the visual system. And in addition to this architecture, they have this convolution operation, which is also a type of mechanism that is existing in the visual system. So when the network is trained by retropropagation, in this case, it turns out that the weights, they will eventually turn out to detect particular features, for example, horizontal lines or vertical lines or colors. So just a few words on this convolution operation, which is a critical element, characteristic. So the convolution is referring to the fact that when we have an image like here, the machine does not analyze the whole image, but it's just focusing on a small part here we call a receptive field. In this case, it would be this 5 by 5 area. And so the neuron is really just computing the weighted sum of this small area, and then, computes the results that entered into the table of the feature map. And then we go on, we take the same receptive field and we move it just 1 pixel besides, and we do the same computation, the same weighted sum, and the result is then written in the table just next to it. So on, it's repeated through the whole visual field, and this is then producing here as a result the output, which is in this case a feature map. So in this case, these N1 neurons, they are really detecting a specific feature in all parts of the image because they have the same weight. So they are. And so just here, the feature map, it's signaling either the presence or the absence of a feature that is being looked for via the convolution kernel. And if you want to detect several features, of course, you need to have several convolution kernels, and this will produce several maps. And what's really interesting here is that these feature maps, they exist also in that shape in the visual system, and under the shape of simple and complex cells in primary visual cortex. So just a few words on the visual system. So we have here the brain with the image coming through the eye of the retina to first relay stage in subcortical lateral nucleus, and then it's arriving at the back of the brain in the occipital cortex in the primary visual area. And then there are two pathways to process the different, let's say, information content of the visual world. One is the dorsal pathway here, which is more dedicated to localizing objects and processing positions of things in space. And the ventral pathway here, which is also called the temporal pathway, which is really dedicated to specific shape and form and object recognition. And we know nowadays that this ventral pathway is organized into successive visual areas that have each its own retinopathy, and so it's from V1 to V2, somewhere it's V3, but it's not shown here, V3, V4, up to the anterior pole of the inferior temporal lobe here for the highest, let's say, the most complex type of processing. But if we have a look at how information is processed in the first cortical relay station V1, it turns out that in V1, so we have these pyramidal V1 neurons that are stacked in kind of packs of around 60 neurons that are connected to small parts of the visual field, which is their receptive field, and which are, for example, some of them responsive to certain types of orientation. Like in this case, for example, the cell is firing for kind of oblique towards the left, but not at all on this kind of almost horizontal, it would not be firing. And so this was work that was done by Hubel and Wiesel in the 60s. For example, here you have different orientations, or lines of different orientations presented to a neuron in V1. And you see that of all the possible orientations, it would respond mostly to, in this case, the vertical one a little bit when it's tilted slightly to the left, much less when it's tilted slightly to the right. So we have this orientation selectivity, or in other words, these neurons that are called simple cells, they are really detecting the feature, this feature, in this case, the presence of a vertical line in receptive field, in their receptive field. So this is just a kind of simple cells, and actually the simple cells, they're receiving their inputs from the lateral genic nucleus, where the receptive fields, they are just responding to points in the visual field. So there they are not yet selective to orientation. So the V1 is the first station where this more complex feature is being extracted. And so, one cell would, one type of N1 neurons, they would respond to vertical lines, the next ones to slightly tilted, 3 degree tilted, 6 degree tilted, etc., until we go the whole circle. And so this is really, as in the artificial neural networks, they are doing this kind of feature extraction. So, as I said, actually there are packs of 60, more or less 60 neurons that are connected to a small part of the visual field, to a certain receptive field, to detect their specific orientation. And of course, you have millions of neurons detecting the same feature throughout the whole visual field. Just as a summary, so we have to imagine we have here the visual field and then the receptive field of these simple cells, each of which are detecting different features differently, in this case, differently oriented line, and they would fire if they are present in their receptive field and not if they are not present. And then the next step of, let's say, computation would be the computation that's done by the complex cells, and they are aggregating the inputs from several neighboring simple cells, so of the same type. So we have here, if we have here several neighboring simple cells, they would all then go into one complex cell, such that, for example, the complex cell 1 would aggregate all the inputs that from the simple cells that are detecting vertical features in their receptive field of a bunch of neighboring receptive fields. And so they do this by either computing the mean or taking the largest value of the simple cell, which is an operation called pooling, because obviously they pool the information over several neighboring simple cells. And you see that here. For example, that's now a complex cell where the information is coming from several simple cells that each have their receptive field and detect the feature in a small part of the visual field. But this complex cell obviously will respond to any vertical line over this whole little area. And then the same thing is done for slightly tilted, and so on. And and this, I just want to say, this is the effect of this is that it's creating position invariance with respect to the features, that at least some invariance, because it doesn't really matter if the line the vertical line is here or a couple of degrees to the right. In this case, they will always, complex cells will fire as long as it's a vertical line in their slightly broader receptive field. So as a sum, here we have the simple cells, and they are often coming together in these neuron packs, and they react to a line of a specific orientation. Here's the example of a vertical one. And so the entire set of receptive fields is connected, of course, to millions of these simple cells, and they are all detecting the same feature in different positions of the visual field. And then the complex cell here which receives this input from several simple cells, is aggregating this. So it will respond to this orientation, but in a slightly broader range. And so this pooling is constructing this invariance to, for example, translation, but could also be slightly tilted, or it depends actually. In this case, it would be more an invariance to translation. And so this is interesting because this type of functioning of information processing that we see in the visual system, so the simple and the complex cells as they are present in V1, they are really mirrored in a way in these convolutional neural networks, where we also have this convolutional layer and the pooling layer. So we have the input image, and this is processed by first convolution layer, and then at the later stage a pooling layer. So, oops. So a convolution network, it really has first a convolution operation, that's the equivalent of the simple sets we just saw. Then there is a nonlinear transfer function that was not present in the visual system, but it is in these models that is creating another corresponding feature map with the nonlinear transformation, and then this information is pooled by the complex cells, which are the equivalent to the complex cells in the visual system. So actually these convolution networks, they can be considered as kind of stacks of layers with this always the same sequence, convolution, transfer, or often it's what's called the ReLU function, pooling. And next stack, next stack, next stack. And so in sum, we have that in this case really the architecture of the connections of the neural networks, they are fixed. So how the layers are organized and how they are connected. But what is of course not fixed and what's being learned, it's the weights. It's the parameters of these weighted sums. And they need to be, well, they are being determined by learning. And so in a convolution network, the gradient retropropagation is really adjusting the weights such that the neurons in the different layers, they are detecting in the end features that are important to recognize the image. So it depends also on the kind of images and the kind of task, of course, that you ask the network to do. And it turns out then when you training these convolution networks to recognize natural images, actually there are really some neurons of the first layer that do learn to detect these oriented contours, as we just saw in the visual system, that are really very similar. So this would be the kind of output of the first convolution layer that you see, for example. So we really have this, I would say, symmetry or parallels between convolution network architecture and the visual system architecture. And then, of course, for the convolution networks, the aim of all this is then that you can take an image, and then afterwards, after training, you will, the network will give you an output label. That is obviously should also be in agreement with the human judgment, so that it would be like we judge it correct. And as I just said, so these bundles of convolution transfer pooling layers, they actually can be kind of corresponded to the different visual areas that I was briefly alluding to before, where we know that visual information is being processed in more and more, let's say, sophisticated manners, which have their own retinotopy and feature maps. So really along the network here, what we see is that from V1 going to intratemporal cortex, the receptive fields of the neurons increase. So in V1, the response would be only to a very limited part of the visual field, but in intratemporal cortex, it would be already much larger areas. And also the feature maps, the characteristics of the features that are being extracted, they are becoming gradually more and more complex, from very simple oriented lines, for example, up to very sophisticated constellation like human faces. And here I can also show the only data that are mine, which is work that I've done in different parts of my career so far. So, for example, here I've brought some images that I've from a study from my PhD, where we measured the neural correlates of orientation, discrimination, and the effect of training on orientation discrimination. So we looked where in the brain, well, that was not a big surprise, but we mapped the response to this kind of oriented gratings compared to just a randomly distributed noise pattern. And this was actually PET scan at the time, so it's a little bit archaic, but you can see here, for example, in the mid-sagittal section, here around the calcarine sulcus, you really, of course, as expected, we found the activation of the primary visual areas predominantly, because these are very simple stimuli, so we won't have like large activations around here, because this is too simple, right? It doesn't activate anymore. And then when you use, so we are at that level here, so where we have very small receptive fields, and the V1 neurons, they are detecting edges, or in this case, oriented lines. And then when you use much more sophisticated stimuli, like, for example, faces, which I worked on during my postdoc. For example, here you have to say if two faces are the same or different. There you see, for example, here in this horizontal slide, actually you see that the activation is already much more in the front of the stream, and even very much so to the front. And so we are somewhere here around V4 and IT with these two activations. You can see them also on the sagittal slides here. They're definitely not back here in the occipital. There will also be activations, of course, but in that case, the activation in V1 will be similar to faces or objects, because here we compare the activation that you observe when you show you have to discriminate faces to similar complex objects, but non-faces, for example, houses, chairs, animals, whatever. So just to say that this is something that is very well established, this hierarchy of visual processing, and that you can really see nowadays also with these neuroimaging techniques. So coming back to the artificial intelligence, so all these convolution networks actually developed, they took off really relatively recently, but they started to develop already a little bit in the 80s, and actually apparently one of the really major breakthroughs or the critical contribution was by Yann Lequin in '89, where he succeeded in doing such a convolution network here with a couple of convolution layers and then some final layers that don't have this convolution property anymore. And this network was able at the time to classify handwritten digits, which was not a trivial because of the large variability of the digit shapes. And then this was also mentioned on Sunday by one of the speakers. Another breakthrough was in 2012 when there was this kind of convolution network that in this case was an 8-layer network that was winning this ImageNet challenge, where the challenge is to classify or identify objects within millions of real-world images. And that was really, with this architecture, there was really like a very qualitatively better performance than anything that had been obtained before with other kind of approaches. So really, the success of these kind of networks, it really demonstrated that the basic features of the visual system found by neuroscientists, they are correct in the sense that they are capable of supporting vision. And in what was the difficulty, but was then also once it was solved, which made the success of convolution neural networks, is to find the appropriate learning and training algorithms in these more sophisticated multi-layer architectures. And then after 2012, there was a lot of work on these CNNs. And there are, for example, on the different parameters like the depth, so the number of layers, exactly where the pooling layers are placed, the number of feature maps per layer, the training procedure, and etc. So, and just to situate nevertheless, all this work, of course, on the convolutional neural networks, their aim is to create models that are performing better on standard image identification, classification, benchmarking tests. And they also, the other aim is to make them smaller, as efficient as possible, and to make them trainable with as little data as possible. So the aim eventually is not any longer, of course, to do any kind of correspondence for this kind of neural networks with the actual biology. That was just an inspiration. So if we ask here if the brain can serve as a model for machine intelligence, this is the answer of Yann Lequin, who, based on this inspiration from the work of Prouvel and Wiesel, said that indeed the major general ideas that are retained by artificial intelligence are this existence of local connection. So the idea that a neuron in the first layer of the visual area is connected to only just a small part of the whole visual field, that is receptive fields. And on the other side, this idea of feature detection, so that you can replicate this very simple operation throughout the whole image or visual field, and do this to detect the same feature over different positions. These are really, according to him, two major ideas. And then, to take a little bit broader stance, more generally, this is Demis Hassabis from DeepMind, who is also a neuroscientific himself. For him, the two contributions of, the main contributions of neuroscience to artificial intelligence are the fact that really, the brain structures, they can function as an inspiration, as they did now for simple and complex cells here, but for example, there are also other networks that are inspired by navigation processes and grid cells that we know that exist in the hippocampus, and also to validate plausibility sometimes of completely artificially designed algorithms. But he also points out that, of course, there are many challenges ahead, and one of them would be, of course, to even better understand at the precise algorithmic level how the brain is working, and really to understand what is this exact nature of the representation and the processing that the brain is using to portray the world, this conceptual knowledge, for example. So, having discussed a little bit this question, how if the brain is a good model for machine intelligence, we can also ask the question the other way around, just very briefly, and say to what degree can artificial intelligence models help us understand how the brain works. In this case, how can convolutional neural networks help advanced neuroscience? Is that the case? Will it be the case? And so just as for the moment in the field, there is indeed a lot of inspiration also in the field of neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience from artificial intelligence and these convolutional neural networks to the work on understanding the brain, because they can be used to validate intuitions by trying to formalize them and to test them. And of course, they can also, it's very convenient to explore new hypotheses in a very controlled and precise and confined environment, which the brain is not. It's messy. And then it is, of course, very importantly opening the whole questions to the use of mathematical approaches and analysis. And yeah, many people would agree, I think, that the convolutional neural networks, they really have, they've played this kind of role for the recent advances and research of neuroscience to understand the visual system. And so just very briefly, an example of this. So if we take this modern convolution network, so just as a reminder, so we convolve a set of filters with an input image here to get a feature map. Then with pooling, we create these complex-like responses, And then there are several iterations of this pattern, of these stacks. And then here is a fully connected layer, and then a classifier layer in the end to get an output. And what is possible then is when you design this kind of models, you can then try and see how the response in these models, oops, sorry, I'm too fast. For example, at a specific layer, whether and how it is corresponding to some activity that you record in the brain at a certain stage of this visual system. You can do this either by, as here, using recordings, neural recordings, obviously in animals, or you can do it using imagery, non-invasive imagery techniques in humans. And then if you find some correspondence, of course, this is greatly understanding and clarifying the underlying, helps to clarify the underlying mechanisms, of course. And that's quite a number, well, it's some, let's say, neuroscientists are actually trying to do exactly this. And this is just an example of 2014 of this paper where they really showed that it was possible with these convolutional neural networks to predict the activity of real neurons really beyond any accuracy that had ever until now been achieved. This really seems to be another support, yes, for the accuracy, or at least of some form of information processing. Just, yeah, I won't go into the detail, but the idea is that you design a model to describe and process and identify some image characteristics, and you present this image also to the brain, and you record in different regions of the brain, and you would see if, for example, a certain layer here would provide responses that are corresponding to a certain stage in the brain, for example, before, and a layer that's more advanced would correspond to another responses in a more advanced area in the visual system, that in this case would be IT. And actually, there is recently quite a trend of researchers, the computational neuroscientists, that they say that that's actually all we should do. But so there it is. They really say that actually we should do more, use these deep learning models to really use it as a framework for neuroscience. And so they rely on this main component of these artificial neural networks that are the objective function, the architecture, and the learning rules to really help us better understand exactly how the visual system works. They say, for example, here, in that manifesto, they say, we argue that a greater focus on these components would also benefit systems neuroscience. And then they give example how this optimization-based framework can drive theoretical and experimental progress in neuroscience. But these are about 35 authors, so it's a small part, but yet I think it's definitely one of the, a small part of all the people working. It's a large number of authors, but it's a small part of people working on the field. But they will, I think it will be influential, and that's certainly one of the directions that the field will be going into. Yes, so I think I can wrap up and say that finally there is this kind of two-way interactions, once from the brain inspiring neural networks, and then the other way around. The retour de l'ascenseur, you can also be inspired to understand the brain from the neural networks. But of course, as always, there are quite some reservations and limitations. For example, here Demis Hassabis is really stressing this, and many also say that. So it's really a simple transfer that you have from mechanisms that we find in the brain to neural networks, or the other artificial neural networks, and the other way around. And then there are these key questions that I already mentioned. How is conceptual knowledge acquired that we also don't know for the brain, so we don't know it for the machine. And then on the slightly other question and discussion is to what degree would we really need more brain-like components or cell-like components, let's say, rather than this artificial type of McCullers and Pitt neurons. And of course, we have this artificial intelligence paradox that indeed all these networks, they are really extraordinarily powerful and specialized, but they have also no common sense at all. So I think that's also an agreement, and I just wanted to finish by quoting here Emmanuel Macron. I'm not French, but I think he said it nicely. He says, though, the artificial intelligence is not endowed with any concept, it has no culture, and it understands nothing. So, thank you for your attention.